You know what's crazy? The most decorated military unit in American history fought for a country that locked up their families behind barbed wire. I'm talking about the 492nd Regimental Combat Team, Japanese Americans who volunteered to fight in World War II while their own parents were sitting in internment camps. These guys earned more medals of honor, more Distinguished Service Crosses, and more Silver Stars than any other unit their size in the entire history of the United States military. 21 medals of honor from just 14,000 soldiers. Think about that for a second. 21 medals of honor. That's the highest military decoration you can get in America. The thing they give you when you've basically done something so heroic that it sounds made up. And these guys got 21 of them. But here's what makes this story even more wild. Most Americans have no idea this unit even existed. We learn about D-Day in school. We learn about Pearl Harbor. But nobody teaches you about the Japanese Americans who fought in Europe while their families were imprisoned back home in America. So why did they do it? And how did a group of soldiers who were considered enemy aliens by their own government become the most legendary fighting force in US military history? That's what we're about to find out. December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. Over 2,400 Americans die. The country goes into full panic mode. And if you were a Japanese American living in California, Oregon, or Washington, your life was about to get turned completely upside down. Within months, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. What did that mean? It meant that if you had Japanese ancestry, even if you were born in America, even if you'd never set foot in Japan, you were now considered a potential threat to national security. 120,000 people. That's how many Japanese Americans got rounded up and sent to internment camps. Families were given like a week's notice. Sell your house, sell your business, pack what you can carry. Everything else, gone. These weren't prisoner of war camps. These were American citizens. People who owned businesses, went to church, paid their taxes. Kids who went to American schools and played baseball and did everything that American kids did. And now they were behind barbed wire in the middle of nowhere. Desert camps in California, Wyoming, Arizona, places where summer temperatures hit 110 degrees and winter dropped below freezing. Families crammed into single rooms in wooden barracks, communal bathrooms, communal dining halls, guards with rifles watching them 24/7. The whole thing was based on racism and fear. There was never any evidence of mass disloyalty. In fact, the FBI and military intelligence had already investigated the Japanese-American community and found nothing to suggest they were a threat. But it didn't matter. The government did it anyway. Now here's where it gets interesting. At first, Japanese Americans weren't even allowed to serve in the military. After Pearl Harbor, the government classified them as 4C, enemy aliens, banned from service. But then something changed. By 1943, the military was desperate for soldiers. The war in Europe was grinding on. Casualties were piling up. They needed men. So the government decided to create an all-Japanese American combat unit. They'd let these guys volunteer to fight, but they'd keep them separate from everyone else. The logic was twisted. The same government that had locked up their families was now asking them to risk their lives for their country. So what did they do? Thousands of them volunteered. Think about that. Your family is behind barbed wire. You've lost everything you owned. The government has basically said you're not trustworthy enough to live in your own home, and they're asking you to go fight for them. And you say yes. Why would anyone do that? The 492nd Regimental Combat Team officially formed in early 1943. The army recruited from two places. First, from the internment camps. Second, from Hawaii, which had a huge Japanese-American population that hadn't been interned. The Hawaiian guys? They volunteered in massive numbers. We're talking about over 10,000 volunteers for just 2,600 spots. They weren't angry about internment because most of them hadn't experienced it. They just wanted to prove their loyalty and fight for America. The mainland guys were different. These were the ones whose families were locked up. And when the government came asking for volunteers, a lot of them were like, "Are you serious right now?" But even from the camps, thousands volunteered. One of the most famous volunteers was a guy named Daniel Inouye. He was from Hawaii. When Pearl Harbor happened, he was 17 years old and working as a medical aide. He literally watched the Japanese planes attack. He wanted to enlist immediately, but the military wouldn't take him because of his ancestry. When the 402nd started recruiting, he was one of the first to sign up. He'd later become one of the most decorated soldiers in American history and eventually a U.S. senator. But we'll get to his story later. The recruits were sent to Camp Shelby in Mississippi for training, and right away there was tension. The guys from Hawaii and the guys from the mainland did not get along. The Hawaiian soldiers called themselves the Buddha Heads. The mainland guys were called the Katonks. Why? Because apparently that's the sound a coconut makes when you hit someone over the head with it. Yeah, there were fights. The Hawaiian guys thought the mainland guys were too quiet, too bitter, too resentful. The mainland guys thought the Hawaiians didn't understand what they'd been through. How could they? Their families were free. They hadn't lost everything. The officers had to step in multiple times to break up brawls. At one point, they thought the unit might fall apart before it even got overseas. But then something happened that changed everything. The Hawaiian soldiers got a chance to visit some of the internment camps. They saw the conditions their fellow Japanese Americans were living in: barbed wire, guard towers, families in tiny rooms, and suddenly they got it. One of the Hawaiian soldiers later said that visiting the camps was the moment he understood why the mainland guys were so angry. He said he realized that these guys had every reason to hate America, and yet they'd still volunteered to fight. That's when the unit came together. They stopped fighting each other. They started fighting for each other. Their motto became "Go for broke." It's a gambling term from Hawaii. It means risk everything, bet it all. And that's exactly what they did. The 402nd shipped out to Europe in 1944. Their first combat action was in Italy. The Italian campaign was brutal. Mountains, mud, cold. The Germans were dug in on high ground and fighting like hell. American forces were taking heavy casualties trying to push north. The 402nd got thrown right into it. Their first major battle was at a place called Belvedere. It was a hilltop that the Germans had fortified. Multiple American units had tried to take it and failed. The casualties were insane. The 442nd got the order to attack. They went up that hill at night in freezing rain. The Germans hit them with everything they had: machine guns, mortars, artillery. Guys were getting cut down left and right, but they kept going. They fought their way up that hill in hand-to-hand combat, grenades, bayonets, close quarters fighting in the dark. By morning, they'd taken the hill. The 452nd had done what multiple other units couldn't, and they'd done it in less than a day. But it came at a cost. Casualties were high. Guys who'd trained together at Camp Shelby were dead. The survivors had to keep moving. There was no time to process it. After Belvedere, the 442nd kept fighting through Italy. They took town after town. The Germans started calling them the Purple Heart Battalion because they took so many casualties. Purple Hearts are the medal you get when you're wounded or killed in action. The 442nd was earning them faster than any other unit, but they were also earning respect. Other American soldiers started to notice. These Japanese-American guys fought differently. They didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. When they got an order to take a position, they took it, no matter what it cost. There's a story about a soldier named Sadao Munimori. He was from California. His family was in an internment camp while he was fighting in Italy. In April 1945, his squad was pinned down by German machine gun fire. They were stuck in the open and getting torn apart. Munamori charged the machine gun nest by himself. He threw grenades, took it out, and saved his squad. But then a German grenade landed right next to two of his men. Munamori dove on it. He smothered the blast with his own body. The two guys survived. Munamori didn't. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His family got the medal while they were still living behind barbed wire in an internment camp. Let that sink in. Your son dies saving American soldiers. The government gives him the highest military honor, and you receive it while you're imprisoned by that same government. That's the reality these families were living in. After Italy, the 422nd was sent to France. This is where they'd face their most famous battle. October 1944, the Vosges Mountains, eastern France near the German border. American forces were pushing toward Germany, but the terrain was a nightmare. Dense forests, mountains, cold and wet. The Germans had been fortifying the area for years. The 422nd was assigned to the 36th Infantry Division. Their mission was to push through the Vosges and break through the German defensive line. It was slow, brutal fighting. The Germans were dug in. Every hill, every forest, every town was a fight. But then something happened that would become legendary. A battalion of Texan soldiers, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, got cut off behind German lines. They were surrounded in the forest, completely isolated, no supplies, running out of ammo. The Germans were closing in. These guys became known as the Lost Battalion. The army tried multiple rescue attempts. They all failed. American units kept attacking the German positions and getting pushed back. Casualties were piling up. It looked like the Lost Battalion was going to be wiped out. Then the 422nd got the order. Go get them. The 442nd pushed into the forest. The Germans hit them immediately. Machine gun nests, snipers, artillery. The forest was so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you. Every tree could be hiding an enemy soldier. The 422nd fought through it. Guys were getting shot, blown up by mines, cut down by machine gun fire, but they kept moving forward. They fought for 6 days straight. No rest, barely any food, just pushing deeper into German territory. One of the soldiers in the 422nd, a guy named Barney Hajiro, single-handedly took out 2 German machine gun nests. He crawled through enemy fire, threw grenades, and cleared the positions by himself. He got shot in the arm doing it, but kept fighting. He later received the Medal of Honor. Another guy, James Okubo, was a medic. While the battle was raging, he was running through gunfire to treat wounded soldiers. At one point, he was treating a guy who got shot again while Okubo was working on him. Okubo stayed with him under fire and saved his life. He did this over and over for days. He also later received the Medal of Honor. On October 30th, 1944, the 442nd broke through. They reached the Lost Battalion. 211 Texan soldiers were saved. The men of the 422nd had fought through heavily fortified German positions, taken insane casualties, and pulled off what everyone thought was impossible. But here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The 442nd suffered over 800 casualties to save 201 men. That's not a typo. They lost more men than they saved. Over 800 wounded or killed in 6 days, and yet they did it. When the Lost Battalion survivors saw the 442nd, there was this moment of silence. These Texan guys had no idea who was coming to save them. When they saw Japanese-American faces, some of them were confused, but then they realized what these guys had just done for them. One of the Texan soldiers later said he'd never forget it. He said the men of the 442nd looked like they'd been through hell, covered in mud and blood, exhausted, half of them wounded, but they'd come anyway. The rescue of the Lost Battalion became one of the most famous actions of World War II. The 442nd was showered with praise. They got a Presidential Unit Citation, which is basically a medal for an entire unit, but the cost was devastating. The 452nd was decimated. They'd lost so many men that they had to pull back and get reinforcements before they could fight again, and they weren't done yet. After France, the 442nd was sent back to Italy. The war was entering its final phase. The Allies were pushing into Germany from the west. The Soviets were coming from the east. It was only a matter of time before Germany collapsed. But the fighting wasn't over. In April 1945, the 402nd was tasked with breaking through the Gothic Line. This was a heavily fortified German defensive line in northern Italy. It was one of the last major barriers before the Allies could push into Austria and link up with the Soviets. The Germans were defending it with everything they had: bunkers, minefields, machine guns. The terrain was mountains and ridges, perfect for defense. The 442nd attacked. One of the key battles was for a mountain called Mount Nebbione. The Germans were dug in on the summit. Multiple units had tried to take it and failed. The 492nd went up at night. They climbed the mountain in complete darkness. The Germans heard them coming and opened fire. Guys were falling off the mountain, getting shot, hitting mines. It was chaos, but they kept climbing. By dawn, the 442nd had taken the summit. They'd pushed the Germans off and held the position. The Gothic line was broken. This is where Daniel Inouye's story gets even more insane. Inouye was a lieutenant by this point. On April 21st, 1945, he was leading his platoon in an attack on German positions. They came under heavy fire from 3 machine gun nests. Inouye charged the first one. He took it out with grenades. Then he moved to the second one, took that out too. He got shot in the stomach doing it, but kept going. Then he went for the 3rd machine gun nest. He got close, pulled the pin on a grenade, raised his arm to throw it, and a German soldier fired a rifle grenade at him. The grenade hit Inouye's right arm and basically blew it off at the elbow. His severed arm was still holding the grenade with the pin pulled. Inouye pried the live grenade out of his dead hand with his left hand and threw it at the machine gun nest. Took it out. Then he kept fighting. He was shot in the leg. He still kept firing his weapon and directing his men until he passed out from blood loss. Inouye survived. They amputated his arm. He spent 20 months in hospitals recovering. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. But here's something crazy. He didn't actually receive it until the year 2000. Why? Because of racism. The military didn't want to give a Medal of Honor to a Japanese American during the war. So they gave him a Distinguished Service Cross instead, which is the 2nd highest decoration. It wasn't until President Bill Clinton reviewed the records in 2000 that Inouye and 20 other Asian American soldiers were upgraded to Medals of Honor 55 years later. By May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The 442nd had fought in 7 major campaigns across Italy and France. They'd earned more than 18,000 individual decorations, 7 Presidential Unit Citations, 21 Medals of Honor. They were the most decorated unit for their size in US military history, but the cost was staggering. The 442nd suffered a casualty rate of over 300%. That means that the unit had to be replaced more than 3 times over because of the number of men killed and wounded. Think about that. If you joined the 442nd, you had more than a 300% chance of being killed or wounded at some point. That's not normal. That's not how war usually works. Most units don't come close to that. So why were their casualties so high? Because they never gave up. They never retreated. When other units would pull back and regroup, the 442nd kept pushing. They took the hardest missions. They fought until the objective was taken or until they physically couldn't fight anymore. And they did all of this while their families were locked up back home. When the war ended, The men of the 452nd came home to a country that still didn't fully accept them. Yes, they were heroes. Yes, they'd proven their loyalty. But they were still Japanese American in a country that had just fought a war against Japan. Some of them came home to find their families had lost everything. Businesses sold off for pennies, property seized. Some families had been released from the camps but had nowhere to go. The soldiers themselves faced discrimination. There are stories of guys from the 442nd being refused service at restaurants, being told they couldn't buy houses in certain neighborhoods, being called slurs. One of the most heartbreaking stories is about a soldier who came home decorated with medals and was refused a haircut at a barbershop because he was Japanese. But slowly things started to change. The men of the 442nd didn't just fade away. They became leaders. They became businessmen, politicians, teachers, doctors. They built lives and families and communities. Daniel Inouye became a U.S. Senator from Hawaii. He served for over 50 years. He became one of the most powerful politicians in America. When he died in 2012, he was lying in state at the U.S. Capitol. That's an honor reserved for only the most respected Americans. Other members of the 442nd became judges, mayors, state legislators. They used their experience and their reputations to break down barriers for future generations of Asian Americans. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. This was a formal apology from the U.S. government for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. The government paid reparations to survivors. It was too late for many of them. A lot of the internment camp survivors had already died. But it was acknowledgement. It was the government saying, we were wrong. And a big reason that apology happened was because of the 442nd. Their service had proven beyond any doubt that Japanese Americans were loyal, that the internment had been based on nothing but fear and racism. The 442nd had literally fought their way to recognition. So why am I telling you this story? Because it's one of the most important stories in American history, and most people don't know it. We grow up learning about World War II. We watch movies about D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge. We learn about the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. And all of that is important. But we don't learn about the Japanese Americans who fought for a country that imprisoned their families. We don't learn about the soldiers who took a 300% casualty rate and kept fighting anyway. We don't learn about Daniel Inouye throwing a grenade with his left hand after his right arm got blown off. We don't learn about Sadao Munimori diving on a grenade to save his men while his family was behind barbed wire. These stories matter because they show something fundamental about courage and loyalty and sacrifice. The men of the 452nd didn't have to fight. They could have said no. They could have said, why should we fight for a country that treats us like this? But they didn't. They fought anyway, not because America was perfect, not because the government had treated them fairly, but because they believed in the idea of America. They believed that their country could be better, and they were willing to die to prove it. That's what makes their story so powerful. It's not just about military success. It's not just about medals and decorations. It's about people who faced discrimination and hatred and injustice, and who still chose to serve. And in doing so, they changed America. After the war, the internment camps were shut down. The Civil Liberties Act was passed. Japanese Americans went on to become prominent in business, politics, entertainment, and every other field. And a lot of that progress happened because of what the 442nd did. They proved that loyalty has nothing to do with what you look like or where your ancestors came from. They proved that courage and sacrifice are universal. They proved that America is stronger when we judge people by their actions, not by their race. That's a lesson we're still learning today. Today, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team is remembered as one of the greatest military units in American history. There are monuments to them, museums, books and documentaries, schools named after members of the unit. In 2010, President Barack Obama signed a law granting the Congressional Gold Medal to the 482nd and the 100th Infantry Battalion. That's one of the highest civilian honors in America. But more than that, the legacy of the 482nd lives on in the people they inspired. When Asian Americans serve in the military today, they're following in the footsteps of the 482nd. When anyone fights for a cause bigger than themselves, despite facing discrimination or hardship, they're channeling that same spirit. The motto, "Go for broke," has become a symbol. It's on patches and tattoos. It's quoted in speeches. It represents the idea that sometimes you have to risk everything for what you believe in. And that's what the 442nd did. They went for broke. They bet everything on the idea that their service would matter, that their sacrifice would mean something. And it did. Their story is proof that even in the darkest times, people can choose to do the right thing, even when they have every reason not to. Let's talk about some of the individual soldiers who made the 442nd what it was, because behind every medal and every battle statistic, there were real people with real stories. George Joe Sakato was born in California. When the war started, his family was sent to an internment camp in Arizona. Sakato volunteered for the 442nd anyway. In October 1944, during the same campaign where the lost battalion was rescued, Sakato's unit was pinned down by German forces. Sakato saw that his squad leader had been wounded and was lying exposed to enemy fire. Sakato charged across 75 yards of open ground under heavy machine gun fire. He reached his squad leader, killed 2 German soldiers who were about to execute him, and then single-handedly held off a German counterattack while his men retreated to safety. He was wounded in the action, but refused medical treatment until the mission was complete. For this, he received the Distinguished Service Cross. Like Inouye, his award was later upgraded to the Medal of Honor in 2000. Sakato lived until 2015. He was 94 years old. In interviews later in life, he was always humble about what he'd done. He said he wasn't a hero. He said he just did what he had to do. But think about what that means. This guy's family was locked up. He could have stayed in the camp. Instead, he volunteered to fight, and then he charged across open ground to save his commanding officer. That's not just bravery, that's a different level of commitment. Then there's Shizuya Hayashi. He was from Hawaii. He joined the 442nd in 1943 and fought in Italy and France. In November 1944, Hayashi's unit was tasked with clearing a German-held town. They came under heavy fire from a German machine gun position that had them pinned down. Hayashi grabbed a bazooka and charged the position by himself. He destroyed the machine gun nest with a direct hit, then continued fighting through the town, taking out another enemy position with grenades. He was wounded 3 times during the action, but refused evacuation until the town was secured. He also received the Distinguished Service Cross, later upgraded to the Medal of Honor. After the war, Hayashi went back to Hawaii and lived a quiet life. He didn't talk much about his service. Like a lot of combat veterans, he preferred to move on and focus on his family and community, but the records speak for themselves. This guy took on multiple fortified German positions by himself, got shot 3 times, and kept fighting. And then there's Yaiki Lefty Kobashigawa, another Hawaiian soldier. In June 1944, near the town of Lanuvio in Italy, Kobashigawa's platoon was ambushed by German forces. Machine gun fire was tearing through them. Men were dropping left and right. The platoon was about to be wiped out. Kobashigawa crawled 50 yards under fire to get close to the German machine gun position. He threw grenades and destroyed it. Then he spotted another machine gun position and took that one out too. But he wasn't done. After destroying both positions, he organized the survivors of his platoon and led them in a counterattack that pushed the Germans back. For this action, he received the Distinguished Service Cross. In 2000, it was upgraded to the Medal of Honor. Kobashigawa passed away in 2005. At his funeral, fellow soldiers from the 442nd spoke about how he was always looking out for his men, how he was the kind of leader who would never ask someone to do something he wouldn't do himself. These are the kinds of guys who made up the 492nd. Not superhuman, not invincible, just regular people who kept going when everything told them to stop. One thing that's interesting about the 492nd is how the soldiers from Hawaii and the mainland came together. At the start, like I mentioned, there was tension. The Buddha heads and the Katonks didn't get along. They had different experiences, different attitudes, but by the end of the war, they were brothers. There's a story about how this happened. After the rescue of the lost battalion, the 442nd was pulled back for rest and reinforcements. They were staying in a French town, and some of the guys decided to throw a party. The Hawaiian soldiers invited some local French families. They cooked food, played music, danced. It was a rare moment of joy in the middle of war. The mainland guys, who were usually more reserved, started to open up. They told stories about their families back in the camps. The Hawaiian guys listened, really listened, and something shifted. One of the Hawaiian soldiers later said that was the moment he stopped seeing the mainland guys as bitter or angry. He saw them as people who'd been carrying a burden that no one should have to carry. And the mainland guys saw the Hawaiian soldiers as people who'd chosen to fight even though they didn't have to, even though their families were safe. From that point on, the division between Buddha heads and Katonks disappeared. They stopped being two groups and became one unit. That unity is part of what made the 492nd so effective. They fought for each other. When you're in combat and you know the guy next to you would die for you, you fight harder. You take risks you wouldn't normally take. The 442nd wasn't just a collection of individual soldiers. It was a brotherhood forged in the worst circumstances imaginable. Let's talk about the strategic impact of the 482nd. From a military perspective, the 442nd's success had ripple effects that went beyond their individual battles. First, they forced the military to rethink its policies on race and segregation. Before the 442nd, the US military was heavily segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units. Japanese Americans were banned from service altogether after Pearl Harbor, but the 442nd's combat record was impossible to ignore. They'd proven that Japanese Americans could fight just as well as anyone else, better in many cases. This started a conversation that eventually led to the desegregation of the military. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the armed forces. The 492nd's example was part of what made that possible. Second, the 492nd's actions in Italy and France were strategically important. The battles they fought helped open up the path for the Allied advance into Germany. The Gothic Line breakthrough, for example, was critical in allowing Allied forces to link up with Soviet troops coming from the east. The rescue of the lost battalion wasn't just a feel-good story. Those Texas soldiers went on to fight in other battles. Some of them survived the war and came home to their families. That doesn't happen if the 442nd doesn't break through. And third, the 482nd's success changed how America viewed Japanese Americans. Before the war, Japanese Americans were seen as foreigners, as threats. After the war, they were seen as Americans who'd proven their loyalty in blood. That shift in perception had long-term effects. It made it easier for Japanese Americans to integrate into society after the war. It made it easier for them to fight for their civil rights. It laid the groundwork for the eventual apology and reparations in 1988. None of that happens without the 452nd. But let's not romanticize this too much. The 452nd paid a terrible price for their success. Over 800 casualties in 6 days during the Lost Battalion rescue. Over 9,000 Purple Hearts earned by a unit that only had 14,000 soldiers total. Guys who were wounded, patched up, and sent back into combat only to be wounded again. There are stories of entire companies being wiped out, of officers having to take command of units because all the senior leaders were dead or wounded. One soldier later described the aftermath of a battle where his unit had taken 50% casualties. He said the survivors were so exhausted and traumatized that they couldn't even speak. They just sat there in silence, covered in mud and blood, staring at nothing. That's the reality of what these guys went through. And when they came home, a lot of them struggled. PTSD wasn't really recognized back then. Soldiers were just expected to move on and get back to normal life. But how do you go back to normal after watching your friends die, after killing people, after being shot and blown up and traumatized over and over? Many of the 452nd veterans didn't talk about their service for decades. They kept it to themselves, tried to forget. It wasn't until later in life that some of them started to open up, started to tell their stories, and by then a lot of them had passed away. That's one of the tragedies of the 442nd. A lot of these guys never got the recognition they deserved while they were alive. It took decades for America to fully understand what they'd done. Let's talk about the families for a minute. Imagine you're a mother living in an internment camp. Your son has volunteered to fight in the war. You're proud of him, but you're also terrified. And then you get a telegram. Your son has been wounded. Or worse, your son has been killed. You're grieving, but you're also stuck behind barbed wire. You can't even attend his funeral. You can't visit his grave. All you have is a folded flag and a few medals. That was the reality for hundreds of families. One mother received the Medal of Honor on behalf of her son, Sadao Munamori, while she was still living in an internment camp. The ceremony was held in the camp. Guards were standing outside, and she's being handed the highest military honor America can give. The irony is unbearable. But these families held on. They believed in their sons. They believed that what they were doing mattered, and they were right. After the war, many of the families rebuilt their lives. They started new businesses. They sent their kids to college. They became part of the fabric of American society, but they never forgot what they'd been through, and they made sure their children and grandchildren knew the story of the 442nd. That's why the legacy has survived, because the families kept the memory alive. The 442nd is the most famous Asian American unit from World War II, but they weren't the only ones. There was also the 100th Infantry Battalion, which was made up of Japanese Americans from Hawaii. They fought in Italy and eventually merged with the 402nd. There were Chinese American soldiers who served in integrated units throughout the war. One of them, Francis B.Y., earned the Medal of Honor for his actions in the Philippines. There were Filipino-American soldiers who fought in the Pacific. Many of them were given U.S. citizenship in exchange for their service. And there were Korean Americans like young Oak Kim, who served in the 402nd despite not being Japanese American. Kim became one of the most decorated soldiers in the unit and later reached the rank of colonel. The broader story of Asian Americans in World War II is one of service and sacrifice, often in the face of discrimination and doubt. And the 402nd was at the center of that story. They were the ones who proved that Asian Americans belonged, that they were just as American as anyone else. Today, the 402nd is celebrated, but it took a long time to get there. For decades after the war, the 442nd story was largely forgotten by mainstream America. It was kept alive by the Japanese American community, but most Americans had no idea who they were. That started to change in the 1980s and 1990s. Books were written, documentaries were made, survivors started speaking publicly about their experiences. In 2000, President Clinton upgraded 22 Asian American soldiers' medals to Medals of Honor. This included 21 members of the 442nd. In 2010, the 442nd received the Congressional Gold Medal. In 2012, HBO released a documentary called Honor and Sacrifice, The Roy and Sato Story, which told the story of two brothers who served in the 442nd. In recent years, there have been calls for a major Hollywood movie about the 442nd. Several scripts have been written, but as of now, no movie has been made. Maybe that will change. Maybe someday there will be a big-budget film that tells this story to a wide audience. But even without that, the 482nd's legacy is secure. There are memorials to them in Washington, D.C., in Hawaii, in California, and in Italy and France, where they fought. Every year, survivors and their families gather to remember, to honor the men who served and died. And every year, the story is passed down to a new generation. So what can we learn from the 442nd? First, loyalty isn't about where you come from. It's about what you do. The men of the 442nd were questioned, doubted, and discriminated against. But they proved their loyalty through action. They showed that being American isn't about race or ancestry. It's about shared values and commitment to something bigger than yourself. Second, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite fear. The soldiers of the 442nd were scared. They saw their friends die. They were wounded. They faced impossible odds, but they kept going. That's real courage. Third, history is complicated, and we have to grapple with that. The story of the 442nd is inspiring, but it's also painful. It's a story about people who were treated terribly by their own government and who still chose to serve. That's heroic, but it's also a reminder of how unjust America was, and in some ways still is. We can celebrate the 482nd while also acknowledging the injustice of internment. We can honor their sacrifice while also recognizing that they shouldn't have had to prove their loyalty in the first place. And fourth, stories matter. The 442nd story has inspired generations of Asian Americans. It's given them a sense of pride and belonging. It's shown them that their ancestors were heroes. But it's also a story for all Americans. It's a reminder that the people who make this country great come from everywhere, that diversity is a strength, not a weakness, and that when we judge people by their actions rather than their appearance, amazing things happen. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team fought in some of the bloodiest battles of World War II. They earned more Medals of Honor than any other unit their size in American history. They suffered over 9,000 casualties. They rescued the Lost Battalion. They broke through the Gothic Line. They went for broke. And they did it all while their families were locked up behind barbed wire. That's the story that doesn't get told enough. It's a story of courage, sacrifice, and loyalty in the face of injustice. It's a story about people who believed in America even when America didn't believe in them. And it's a story that should be taught in every school, memorialized in every history book, and remembered by every generation. Because the men of the 442nd weren't just soldiers, they were trailblazers, they were heroes, and they were proof that the American dream is for everyone, no matter what they look like or where they come from. So the next time someone asks you what the most decorated unit in American history is, you tell them about the 492nd. You tell them about Daniel Inouye throwing a grenade with his severed arm. You tell them about Sadao Munimori diving on a grenade to save his men. You tell them about the Lost Battalion and the 6 days of hell the 452nd fought through to save them. And you tell them that these men did all of this while their families were imprisoned, while they were considered enemy aliens by their own government, because that's a story worth knowing. Hit subscribe if you want more history that schools don't teach.